Teacher calls Muslim boy a liar about his dad's job, goes silent when a 4-star general walks in. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our dream too. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of room 204, casting warm golden stripes across the rows of wooden desks. 11-year-old Adam Rahman sat quietly in the back row, the same place he chose every day, not out of fear, but because he liked observing the world before stepping into it. His fingers tapped gently against the fabric of his backpack, the one his father brought back from overseas. The room smelled of pencil shavings and the faint chemical scent of dry erase markers, yet beneath these familiar smells lived something else, something Adam had noticed ever since he transferred here a month ago, a sense that he didn't quite belong. Some students glanced at him with brief curiosity, others with confusion, as if trying to understand why he prayed quietly before lunch or why he sometimes whispered Arabic phrases to calm himself. He wasn't ashamed of who he was. His father had taught him to walk with his head high, but fitting into a new school wasn't easy when people didn't know you, yet felt like they already did. At the front of the room, Miss Hawkins stood in her usual stiff posture, her shoulders pulled back and her chin raised as if she were measuring the worth of the entire classroom in a single glance. She erased yesterday's lesson with swift, almost aggravated strokes, each motion loud enough to make several students wince. She was known as strict, but to Adam she felt like a storm cloud that hovered only above him. Whenever she took attendance, her voice faltered for the smallest fraction of a second at his last name. Whenever he raised his hand, her gaze narrowed briefly, but enough for him to notice. And whenever she discussed topics like world affairs or military operations, her eyes somehow found him, lingering just long enough to make his stomach tighten. She never said anything directly, nothing that could be written down or proven, but Adam had learned long ago that prejudice didn't always shout, sometimes it whispered from behind polite tones and tightly drawn smiles. Today, the lesson was about community roles and different kinds of careers, a subject Adam secretly loved. It reminded him of his father's stories told rarely, and only when the night felt calm enough to hold them. His father, Colonel Ibrahim Rahman, was a man of unwavering discipline but deep warmth, someone who could speak with absolute authority in one moment and then kneel beside Adam's bed to fix a crooked blanket in the next. Adam always felt safest when his father was home. And though his father rarely described his missions, Adam sensed the weight he carried, the responsibility, the sacrifice, the quiet courage. That was his hero. His role model. His world. So when Ms. Hawkins announced they would be sharing what their parents did for a living, Adam felt a small spark of pride flicker to life in his chest. But as soon as Ms. Hawkins began calling on students one by one, that spark trembled. The classroom filled with voices as children proudly announced, "My mom is a nurse, my dad runs a bakery, my uncle is a firefighter." Laughter mingled with excitement. But when Miss Hawkins' eyes finally drifted to the back row and settled on Adam, something inside him tightened. She lifted one eyebrow, that familiar look of skepticism already forming before he even spoke. "Adam," she said, her tone clipped and cold, "why don't you tell the class what your father does?" The room fell quiet. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Adam swallowed, straightened his posture just like his father taught him, and prepared to speak, completely unaware that this moment would ignite the conflict that would change everything. The silence that followed Ms. Hawkins' question stretched through the classroom like a tightened wire, fragile yet ready to snap. Adam felt dozens of eyes on him, some curious, others impatient, but many simply indifferent. After all, it wasn't their turn under the spotlight. He took a slow breath, steadying himself the way his father taught him, feet planted, shoulders relaxed, voice calm. "My father is a 4-star general in the United States Army," he said, his words measured and honest. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen. Then a ripple of whispered disbelief swept over the class. A few students exchanged glances and small smirks, as if he just claimed something impossible. Others leaned back in their seats, eyebrows lifted. Adam could feel his cheeks warming, not with embarrassment but with the sting of misunderstanding. He wasn't lying. He would never lie about his father. But he could already sense the disbelief thickening in the air, wrapping around him like a fog he couldn't escape. Miss Hawkins' reaction cut deeper than the stares of his classmates. Her lips curved into a thin, incredulous smile, the kind adults use when they think a child is being foolish but don't want to say it outright. A 4-star general, she repeated, each word dripping with skepticism. Adam, sweetheart, you don't have to make up stories to impress us. The room erupted in muffled laughter. A boy in the front row snorted. A girl whispered something behind her hand. Even students who hadn't paid much attention earlier now turned around, eager to watch the humiliation unfold. Adam felt the back of his throat tighten, yet he kept his gaze steady. I'm not lying, he said softly but firmly. My father really is a general. But Miss Hawkins' eyes hardened. She crossed her arms, leaning against her desk as though preparing to lecture him. Enough, she said sharply. We value honesty in this classroom. Making up extravagant claims is not acceptable. For the first time, Adam felt a flicker of anger override his fear. Not everyone in the classroom wanted to laugh. Sam Rivera, who sat 2 rows ahead of Adam, glanced back with a conflicted expression. Sam had been friendly since the first week, not exactly a close friend, but someone who never joined in teasing. His brow furrowed as he watched Miss Hawkins dismiss Adam so forcefully. On the other side of the room, Maya Henderson, quiet and thoughtful, bit her lip, her fingers tightening around her notebook. Maya didn't like conflict, but she hated unfairness even more. She had seen the way Miss Hawkins treated Adam, small moments that others ignored but she noticed. The hesitation at his name. The curt tone. The dismissive sighs. She felt her stomach twist as she watched Adam shrink slightly in his seat, not from shame but from exhaustion. Beside her, a few students whispered, "Why would he lie about that? He probably just wants attention." The comments swarmed through the room like mosquitoes, irritating, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Each one landed on Adam's shoulders, weighing them down little by little. It wasn't just about disbelief, it was about the assumption behind it. That a Muslim boy couldn't possibly have a father who was a decorated general. But the worst part came when Miss Hawkins stepped closer and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Adam, tell the truth. Your father is not a general. People like you don't have fathers in positions like that." For a moment, the entire room stopped breathing. Even the students who had been laughing stared at her in stunned silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, filling the heavy quiet. Adam's heart pounded so hard he could hear it echoing in his ears. People like you. The word struck him harder than any insult he had heard before. Not because he didn't understand what she meant, but because he understood all too well. Miss Hawkins wasn't accusing him of lying anymore. She was reducing him to a stereotype, dismissing him not for what he said, but for who he was. Sam's eyes widened. Maya's face flushed with anger. But Adam sat perfectly still, gripping the edge of his desk, trying to keep his voice steady even though his world suddenly felt tilted. And while no one in the classroom said anything, a new unspoken tension filled the air, one that hinted that everything was about to change. The classroom stayed frozen for several unbearable seconds after Miss Hawkins' words. Adam felt as if the world had tilted beneath him, the floor sliding just a little out of place. People like you. The phrase echoed in his mind, each repetition sharper than the last. He stared down at the wood grain of his desk, afraid that if he lifted his eyes, he'd see every student watching him through the lens of her accusation. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, not from shame but from an ache he didn't know how to name. He had always known that being different came with challenges, but he had never imagined that an adult, a teacher meant to protect and guide, would say something so cruel so openly. A hollow pressure filled his chest, squeezing tight as he tried to steady his breathing. He wasn't embarrassed. He was hurt. Sam was the first to move. He turned fully in his chair, looking directly at Adam with an expression that blended confusion, anger, and disbelief at Miss Hawkins. "He's not lying," Sam blurted out before he could stop himself. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence. Several students gasped, shocked that someone would openly challenge the teacher. Maya followed, her eyes bright with determination as she raised her hand sharply. "Miss Hawkins, that wasn't fair," she said. You didn't even let him explain. Her voice trembled, but her courage did not. The room shifted. Students who had laughed earlier now looked uncertain, unsure if they had just witnessed something wrong. Others glanced at the door as if expecting someone to intervene. But the only person who moved was Miss Hawkins, who stiffened as though stung by their defiance. Her voice snapped like a ruler against a desk. "Enough," she barked, glaring at Maya first, then Sam. "I will not tolerate disrespect." She turned her cold gaze back to Adam. "And I will not tolerate lies." She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply, each sound punctuating her authority. "If your father were really a 4-star general, he'd be far too important to have time for parent-teacher meetings or school concerns. This story of yours is simply impossible." Adam lifted his eyes just slightly. He wanted to defend himself, to say something, anything, but his throat felt tight, as if someone had closed a hand around it. He knew that no matter what he said, she wouldn't believe him. The frustration pressed against his ribs like a weight he couldn't lift. The room seemed smaller, the air thinner, as the tension wrapped around everyone present. Then Adam did something he rarely did. He spoke up, even though every part of him felt heavy. "I'm not lying," he whispered. It wasn't loud, but it struck the room like thunder. Miss Hawkins' expression twisted with irritation. She opened her mouth to respond, perhaps to scold him again, perhaps to dismiss him entirely, but before she could utter a single word, a sharp knock sounded at the classroom door. The entire class turned as the door handle slowly began to rotate. And though no one inside the room knew it yet, that small knock was the beginning of the moment that would change everything. The knock echoed through the classroom with a clarity that cut straight through the tension. Every student turned as the door handle clicked, followed by the slow, deliberate push of the heavy wooden door. Miss Hawkins straightened instantly, smoothing her blouse as if preparing to greet another teacher or perhaps the principal. Her expression shifted into a forced smile that did nothing to hide the irritation beneath it. But when the door finally opened fully, the air in the room changed in a way none of them could describe. A tall shadow stretched across the floor before the figure even entered. And then, one heavy boot stepped inside, polished, black, unmistakably military. A uniform followed, crisp, decorated with ribbons and insignias no one in that classroom had ever seen up close. The silence was absolute. Colonel Ibrahim Rahman filled the doorway with a presence that was both commanding and calm. His posture was perfect, his jaw set, and his expression unreadable as his sharp eyes scanned the room. Adam froze where he sat. His breath caught in his throat as his father's gaze finally landed on him, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a quiet, focused concern he recognized instantly. Miss Hawkins, meanwhile, seemed unable to decide whether to speak or stand still. She blinked several times, her confident exterior beginning to crack as she tried to place what she was seeing. A few students whispered under their breath, stunned, trying to make sense of why a high-ranking officer was standing in the doorway of room 204 in the middle of a Monday morning. Sam nearly fell out of his chair. Maya's eyes widened, hands lifting over her mouth. "Good morning," Colonel Rahman said, his voice deep and controlled, filling the classroom without raising in volume. "I was told my son was asked to speak about me today." He stepped farther inside, and the medals on his chest glinted under the fluorescent lights. Miss Hawkins opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She swallowed hard, her earlier confidence completely gone. I had no idea," she stammered, her face draining of color. "I wasn't expecting." The colonel raised a hand gently, not in reprimand, but in a composed gesture that silenced her more effectively than any shout. "I understand," he said calmly. "But I also understand my son was accused of lying." The room crackled with tension. Adam felt his chest tighten with a mixture of fear, relief, disbelief, and something else, something warm. Colonel Rahman turned toward Adam, his stern expression softening just slightly. "I came to make sure he never feels the need to hide who he is or where he comes from," he said. "Truth should never be punished." Miss Hawkins finally found her voice again, but it trembled. "Colonel, I meant no disrespect," she lied poorly. The colonel met her eyes with steady calm. Respect is not measured by words, he replied, but by how we treat those who depend on us. No one breathed. No one moved. The weight of his words settled into the air like a verdict. For the first time since Adam entered that school, the room felt like it was on his side. For a long moment, no one in room 204 dared to move. The presence of Colonel Rahman was overwhelming, not because he was loud or forceful, but because he stood with a calm authority that demanded respect without ever asking for it. Miss Hawkins forced a smile that wavered at the edges, her confidence reduced to a thin veneer barely holding itself upright. Colonel Rahman, she began, clasping her hands together, there must have been some misunderstanding. Your son, he gave an unexpected answer, that's all. Her voice trembled in a way the students had never heard before. Adam watched in disbelief as the teacher who moments ago towered over him now seemed to shrink under the weight of her own choices. Sam and Maya exchanged glances, both aware that something fundamental had shifted, an invisible divide that once isolated Adam was now cracking open. The colonel stepped forward, his boots echoing sharply against the tiled floor. My son does not invent stories, he said plainly. He speaks the truth. If his truth sounded unexpected to you, perhaps the issue is not his honesty but your assumptions. A ripple moved through the room, quiet, powerful, undeniable. Miss Hawkins' throat tightened, the color drained from her cheeks. The students leaned in slightly, their earlier amusement gone, replaced by an understanding they couldn't yet articulate. This wasn't just a correction. It was accountability. And it was the first time they realized the consequences of words they had previously laughed at. Adam's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the dawning recognition that someone, finally, was standing up for him in a way he had never experienced in this school. Desperate to regain control, Miss Hawkins attempted a fragile defense. Colonel, you must understand, children exaggerate. It's normal at this age. The colonel raised an eyebrow, a gesture so subtle yet so devastating that several students held their breath. You titled my son a liar in front of the entire class, he replied. You dismissed him because of who you assumed he was. And that is not normal. It is unacceptable. His words were calm, but each one landed like a stone. Miss Hawkins looked toward her desk, then toward the door, as though searching for an escape route from a truth she had avoided for too long. The room no longer belonged to her. The authority she once wielded so freely now hovered out of reach, slipping through her fingers faster each time she opened her mouth. Adam lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by emotions he didn't know how to organize, relief, pride, sadness, and a quiet ache from how long he had endured without speaking up. He wasn't used to seeing adults defend him. He wasn't used to being believed. And each second of silence following his father's words felt like a breath he had been holding for years finally being released. Sam gave him a small nod, an unspoken "I told you so." Maya offered a soft smile that told him she'd never doubted him. For the first time since he entered the school, Adam felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, the beginning of belonging. And yet, beneath that warmth, he sensed the truth, things were only beginning to unfold. This moment wasn't the end of the conflict. It was merely the first step into a deeper one. The tension in the classroom had softened slightly, but no one dared to relax. Colonel Rahman stood tall, his eyes calm yet carrying a weight that made every student sit straighter. Miss Hawkins forced another tight smile, though her expression twitched with discomfort. Colonel, perhaps we should discuss this privately, she said, her voice cracking at the edges. She wanted desperately to pull this confrontation away from the watching eyes of her students. But the colonel didn't move. Instead, he glanced slowly around the room, acknowledging each child's presence as if their witnessing mattered. No, he replied gently. This happened here. My son was humiliated here. So the truth should be spoken here. The room felt electrified by his firmness. What had started as an awkward classroom moment had transformed into a turning point, not only for Adam, but for everyone present. Miss Hawkins swallowed hard, sensing she was losing any remaining control she had. I assure you, I had no intention of embarrassing him, she insisted. The colonel tilted his head slightly, studying her with a calm that was far more intimidating than anger. Intent does not erase impact, he said. You questioned his integrity because his answer did not fit your expectations. But expectations shaped by bias are not valid. A visible shiver went through the class. Even students who hadn't thought deeply about fairness or prejudice before now felt the truth of his words land like a quiet revelation. Sam leaned forward in his chair, captivated. Maya nodded subtly, recognizing that the colonel was revealing what many of them had sensed but couldn't articulate, that what happened to Adam wasn't an accident. It was part of a pattern. For the first time, Adam saw his father not just as a parent, but as someone who carried the strength of truth in every word. He felt a tightness in his throat, not sadness, but a swelling gratitude he didn't know how to express. His father's presence made him feel taller, braver. The colonel stepped closer to Adam's desk, resting a hand gently on his shoulder. You did nothing wrong, he said quietly, yet loud enough for the class to hear. Never lower your voice to make others comfortable. The words wrapped around Adam like a shield. Miss Hawkins looked away, her breath unsteady. The students watched the scene as if witnessing a moment that would stay with them long after they left the school. Desperate to recover her authority, Miss Hawkins attempted one last tactic. Colonel Ramon, she said, her voice trembling but persistent, perhaps Adam misunderstood my tone. Children do misinterpret emotions. But the colonel shook his head with a slow, deliberate finality. The only misunderstanding, he replied, was yours, underestimating him. The room erupted in a wave of whispered reactions. A revelation settled into everyone's mind. The problem was never Adam's truth. The problem was an adult who refused to see beyond her assumptions. And as Miss Hawkins stood frozen, her authority cracked open and fragile, the students sensed that the story was no longer just about a boy defending the honor of his father. It was about an entire room learning what it meant to confront injustice in real time. The air in room 204 felt heavier than ever, yet strangely alive. What had started as a simple classroom discussion about parents' careers had transformed into something larger, something none of them had expected to witness. Miss Hawkins stood near her desk, fingers gripping its edge as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her eyes flickered anxiously toward the students, then to the colonel, then back to Adam, as if searching for a version of events that didn't cast her in the worst possible light. But the truth hung in the room like a spotlight, illuminating everything she had tried to hide. Sam shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched, and then, surprising even himself, he raised his voice. I've seen you treat him differently before, he said. The room erupted in soft gasps. Sam had stepped into dangerous territory, challenging a teacher directly, but something inside him refused to stay silent anymore. His courage ignited others. Maya lifted her hand sharply, her voice steady but firm. It's true, she said. You always doubt him. Even when he answers the same way we do. A few more students, ones who had never dared speak in class except when called upon, began whispering agreements. What began as hesitant murmurings grew into a chorus of small, reluctant confessions. She always skips over him. She never calls on him. She rolls her eyes when he talks. Each comment added weight to the truth, building a collective testimony that couldn't be ignored. Adam listened, stunned. He never expected anyone to stand up for him, not like this. Not all at once. He had grown used to swallowing discomfort quietly, believing that speaking up would only make things worse. Yet now, watching his classmates step forward, he felt something shift inside, a sense of community forming around him like a fragile but growing light. Miss Hawkins' composure began to crumble. That's enough, she snapped, though her voice lacked the authority it once carried. You are all misinterpreting, but before she could finish, the colonel spoke again, his words calm yet carrying unmistakable power. Children do not coordinate falsehoods, he said. When many voices point in the same direction, it is wise to listen instead of dismiss. The truth in his tone silenced the room again. Miss Hawkins blinked rapidly, her face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. She looked around as if hoping someone, anyone, would defend her. But the room stayed quiet. Every student, even those who weren't particularly fond of Adam or invested in the conflict, understood that something wrong had been exposed. And no one wanted to hide it anymore. For Adam, the moment was overwhelming. He looked at his classmates, Sam, Maya, and even quieter students who rarely spoke, and felt a warmth bloom in his chest. It wasn't just relief. It was validation. Belonging. For the first time since arriving at this school, he felt seen not for what others assumed about him, but for who he truly was. And yet, beneath that warmth, a flicker of uncertainty remained. Miss Hawkins wasn't the type to surrender quietly. The Colonel's presence might have forced her into silence today, but Adam knew the story wasn't finished. A teacher humiliated in front of her students would either change or retaliate. And as the Colonel slowly turned to face the class once more, preparing to speak, Adam sensed the next chapter of this confrontation had already begun forming in the shadows. For a moment, the room seemed balanced between truth and collapse. Adam felt braver than he ever had, surrounded by classmates who had finally spoken up for him. But Miss Hawkins, cornered and humiliated, wasn't finished. Her eyes hardened in a way that made Adam's stomach twist. She straightened her shoulders and drew in a long breath, the kind someone takes before throwing their final blow. "This entire situation," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger, "is being blown out of proportion. I was simply trying to keep order in my classroom." She looked directly at Adam, her expression cold. "And your behavior this morning has been disruptive." The words hit him like a punch. The confidence he had slowly built began to falter. He stared down at his desk again, the weight of her accusation pressing heavily on his chest. Colonel Ramon's expression tightened, just slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He was watching, waiting, allowing the truth to reveal itself fully. Miss Hawkins turned her frustration outward. "You think this is unfair?" she asked the class, her voice rising. "Maybe you're all too young to understand responsibility. Maybe you don't realize how many stories children make up to get attention." The students reacted with shock and discomfort. Sam's jaw dropped. Maya's hands balled into fists. Yet despite the murmurs of disbelief, Miss Hawkins pushed forward, clinging to the last thread of authority she believed she still possessed. "I know what I saw. And I know what tones and attitudes mean." She glared at Adam again. He was defensive. He was evasive. "That's why I questioned him." Her words twisted reality, making Adam feel small, fragile. The warmth he felt moments before began slipping away. Adam felt something inside him waver. The sudden shift, from being defended to being accused again, hit him harder than he expected. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy, as doubt slithered into his mind. Did I do something wrong? Did I sound defensive? Did I make things worse? He had spent so much of his life trying to stay unnoticed, trying to avoid conflict, that being at the center of this storm felt unbearable. His father placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, but Adam struggled to hold back the sting in his eyes. It wasn't just Miss Hawkins' accusations, it was the fear that no matter how much truth he spoke, some people would always see him through a lens of suspicion. For the first time since his father entered the room, Adam felt himself shrinking again. Seeing Adam's shoulders slump, Miss Hawkins sensed a small advantage and stepped toward him, as though reclaiming lost territory. "This could have been avoided," she said sharply, "if you had simply given a realistic answer." That word, realistic, shattered what little strength Adam had left. It was the quiet confirmation of everything she believed about him, that someone like him, a Muslim boy with a name she could barely pronounce, couldn't possibly be telling the truth. His breath shook. For a moment, he felt completely alone again, even with the room full of people. The colonel's jaw tightened, his eyes glinting with something fierce, protective, and unyielding. And just as Miss Hawkins opened her mouth to continue, the colonel took one slow step forward, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The moment had reached its breaking point. Colonel Ramon stepped forward with a calmness so deliberate it silenced the entire room. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, but carried an unmistakable force beneath each word. "Adam," he said, keeping his eyes on his son instead of the teacher, "look at me." Adam lifted his head slowly, fighting the heaviness in his chest. "You told the truth," the colonel continued, his tone warm but firm. "People may doubt you. People may misunderstand you, but your truth does not shrink because someone else refuses to see it. The room felt suspended in time as the colonel then turned to face the class. And courage, he added, is not never feeling small. Courage is standing again, even when someone tries to make you small. The words washed over Adam like sunlight breaking through clouds, pushing back the shadow that had gripped him moments earlier. The students watched in awe. Sam leaned forward, his eyes bright, silently cheering Adam on. Maya nodded subtly, her expression fierce with solidarity. Even students who rarely spoke felt something shift inside them. They were witnessing not just a correction, but a transformation. Miss Hawkins, however, stiffened, sensing the ground slipping entirely from beneath her. She opened her mouth as if to protest again, but the colonel's next word stopped her cold. My son's answer was unrealistic to you, he said, his gaze steady and unblinking, because you built an idea in your mind of what he could or could not be. His voice did not rise, but the power behind it vibrated through the room. Assumptions are dangerous, especially when they decide the worth of a child. Miss Hawkins' composure cracked visibly. Her lips parted, but no explanation came. Her authority, once towering, now felt fragile, exposed. Several students turned their faces away from her, as if ashamed to have once laughed with her. The colonel continued, a teacher's responsibility is not simply to instruct, but to uplift, to guide, to protect. He paused, letting each word settle. Not to wound. The phrase landed like a final verdict. The room was silent, but not empty, it pulsed with a new understanding. Adam felt strength returning to him, not the loud kind, but a quiet, grounded confidence. The kind that came from knowing he wasn't alone. From knowing someone believed him deeply, fiercely, without hesitation. Taking a breath he didn't realize he was holding, Adam lifted his chin. For the first time since the confrontation began, he spoke loudly enough for the entire class to hear. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I felt today, he said. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he continued. Not because of who they are. Not because someone thinks they're less. His words struck the room like a spark, small, but powerful enough to ignite understanding in everyone who heard them. Sam clapped once, loud and proud. Maya joined him. Then others. The applause didn't grow loud, but it grew meaningful, real. Adam felt something in him solidify, not just confidence, but purpose. The colonel placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride shimmering in his eyes. The moment that had once threatened to break Adam now became the moment he stood taller than ever before. The applause faded slowly, but the feeling it left behind lingered like warmth after a long winter. Adam sat a little straighter, breathing deeper than he had all morning. His father's hand rested firmly on his shoulder, anchoring him in a moment he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Miss Hawkins stood rigid at the front of the room, her authority shattered so completely that even she seemed unsure how to gather the pieces. The colonel glanced at her with calm, controlled, but unwavering. Growth, he said gently, is possible only when we first acknowledge where we've failed. His words were not sharp, nor humiliating. They simply held truth. And truth, spoken clearly, had more power than any punishment. Miss Hawkins' lips trembled. For a moment, her defensiveness faded, replaced by something far more human, regret. She looked at Adam, and the hardness in her eyes softened ever so slightly. She exhaled shakily, as though surrendering a weight she had carried for too long. Adam, she said quietly, I judged too quickly. And unfairly. The room froze. No one had expected her to say that, not even Adam. I should not have questioned your honesty, she continued. And I should never have spoken to you the way I did. Her voice cracked, not from fear of the colonel, but from the realization of her own mistake. The students watched with wide eyes as the teacher they once feared now stood humbled before the boy she had dismissed. Adam didn't know what to say at first. He wasn't used to being apologized to, certainly not by an adult who had hurt him so deeply. But he saw something sincere in her expression. And somewhere beneath the anger and confusion, he recognized that forgiveness was not a gift he was giving her, it was a freedom he was giving himself. I forgive you, he said softly. The class erupted in a whisper of awe. Sam smiled broadly, leaning back in his chair with pride. Maya wiped a discreet tear from the corner of her eye. Even the colonel seemed touched, though his expression stayed disciplined and proud. Miss Hawkins blinked in surprise, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had walked in. Thank you, she whispered. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was simply human, raw, vulnerable, and real. She turned to the colonel. I promise to do better. I will make sure every student in this room feels safe and respected. The colonel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. That is all any child deserves. It wasn't approval. It wasn't condemnation. It was acknowledgement, an invitation for her to rise to the responsibility she had nearly failed. As the colonel prepared to leave, he looked once more at his son. I'm proud of you, he said. Not for enduring. Not for staying quiet. But for standing up, first with fear, then with courage. Adam felt his chest swell with warmth. When the door closed behind his father, the classroom felt different. Lighter. New. Miss Hawkins cleared her throat, gathering herself. Class, she said, let's begin again. Her voice was softer this time. More human. Adam exchanged a glance with Sam and Maya, one filled with relief, gratitude, and the quiet thrill of knowing they had lived through something that changed them all. The whisper that once singled him out had become a voice that finally belonged. And as he opened his notebook, Adam felt a certainty settle in his heart, that truth, courage, and compassion would always speak louder than prejudice. And that this moment, was only the beginning of who he was becoming. If you made it this far, subscribe, leave your like, and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you, and see you next time.